All right, so if you've ever needed to animate an arrow at the front of a path, stick around because we're going to learn how to do it right now. Okay, now the good news is this is a pretty simple animation. It's got a couple interesting things that you'll learn through this process. If you've never worked with the pen tool before, this will be a great chance to get familiar with that tool as well. So let's go ahead and hop right in. Let's start with a new comp. We'll go down to the new comp icon. And we'll go with something like HDTV, 24 frames a second. 10 seconds is a decent duration. And so if you want to do this on a black screen, you are definitely welcome to do that. I've gone ahead and grabbed a map that I'm going to use as though we're going on a fictional vacation around the United States. And so here we go. First thing we're going to want to do is grab our pen tool and draw our map on. All right, now make sure you click off the image so that you don't end up drawing a mask. And you'll notice that once we click and drag, our fill becomes pretty obvious that it's turned on. So let's go ahead and click on the word fill and set that to none. We'll click OK. And then we'll go over to stroke. Let's crank that up to about 14 or so, whatever works for you. Now, if you've clicked off a path, you can always get started again by just clicking back on the last point. And so if we draw this curve, notice that I'm just clicking and sort of pulling forward on these Bezier handles. That creates some nice looking curves. The good news is you can always go back and smooth these curves out later or adjust them however you want. And so we'll do a quick loop through here, head up into the East Coast, and then make our way down into Florida. And there we go. Now again, like I said, you can always hit the V key and zoom in here and come in and adjust any of these points by just clicking on them. And you'll notice that that gives me the ability to sort of reactivate these Bezier handles. And if I want to try to smooth anything out, this is going to be the easiest way to do it. So now that we have our path drawn on, we need to go ahead and we need to make it draw on. And in order to do that, we're going to add an effect called trim paths. If I come over here to layers, I'm going to click on the word shape layer. In fact, I'm actually going to hit the return key and label this path, just so I know that that is the path that my arrow will be taking. I'm going to hit the drop down for path, and I'm going to go over to where it says add. Now this is where we can add essentially some parameters to this path. And the one we're going to add is called trim paths. So by clicking on that, you'll see that trim paths shows up right here on my contents for my path. If I open that up, you'll see I have three options inside: start, end, and offset. Now, you might assume that start is where you want to begin, but you'll notice that if we look at start, it's set to 0 right now, which basically means it's at the beginning of its cycle. Now, if I look at this path is completely drawn on, which basically means the path is at the end of its cycle. If I drag this from 0 up to 100, you'll see that it's actually removing my path. Now, all that means is that in this case, using the start control is not going to get me the effect that I'm after. So in this case, animating the start value is not going to work for me. So now I'm going to go down to end. Now if I look at end is at 100, meaning it's completed its cycle, and it is where I want it to end. So for me, for this occasion, we're going to just use the end parameter. So let's go ahead and set our stopwatch to the 1 second mark. And let's crank our end parameter back down to 0. And we'll add a keyframe by clicking the stopwatch. So I have my first keyframe for the trim paths. I'll go ahead and drag my playhead to the 4 second mark. And then I'm going to crank this end value up to 100%. So I just want to point out again, you don't always have to start with the start value. In fact, in a lot of situations, that's not going to give you the results you're after. So the next thing we're going to have to do is apply this motion path we've created to our arrow that's going to go at the front of our shape here. And so to do that, we need to go down to Shape, Path, and go to the path that has the stopwatch next to it. Make sure to click on it and hit Command C to copy that path. Okay, now we're all done with the path. All we need to do is create our arrowhead and apply that path to it. But creating the arrowhead has a couple unique issues we need to solve as well. Let's go ahead and grab either the star tool or the polygon tool. I'll go with the polygon tool. Now I want to point something out about this tool and shape tools in general, and that is that if I click and begin to drag this shape on, you'll notice that the anchor point for this shape ends up in the middle of the composition. Now in this case, that won't work. So what I need to do is I need to move that anchor point to the center of my shape. That can be done by using the pan behind tool to grab it and drag it down there. It can also be done by hitting Option Command Home. But in this case, I want to solve that problem once and for all. So rather than using the pan behind tool or the key command, I'm actually going to come over here to After Effects, Preferences, General. If I click on that, you'll see the option right here in the middle under General to center anchor point in new shape layers. That means that every shape layer I create after clicking this will have the anchor point in the center by default. So let's go ahead and do that. Click OK, and I'm just going to delete this polystar. Come over here and make sure to click off your layers so that's creating this on a new layer. And now let's drag out that polystar again. And you'll notice that the anchor point defaults to the center. Now if you're new to the polystar tool, when you're dragging this out, you can use the arrow keys to add more or less sides to it. So whether you use the polygon tool or the polystar tool, the up and down arrow keys on your keyboard will control the number of points. And in this case, I don't need it quite that big, so I'll shrink it down a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and click off and reselect the layer and come up here to Fill and set it to Solid. Click OK, and I'll set the stroke down to 0. Okay, now I have a point for my arrow. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this layer, hit the return key, title it arrow, and now with the arrow selected, I'm going to hit P for position. And this is where we're going to copy that path data onto our arrowhead. So we need to click the word position and then hit Command V to paste. And you'll notice that the arrow jumps right over to the start point for our path. If I scrub along here, you can see that it looks pretty good, but it's not actually rotating with the path. It's staying in the same position. What we need to do is tell it to orient along the path. And so in order to do that, we're just going to right click on the word arrow. We're going to go up to Transform, and then we're going to come down to Auto Orient. By clicking that, we'll have the option to click Orient Along Path. And if we click OK, now if we look at our arrow, it is changing direction, but unfortunately it's not pointed in the right direction. Also, you notice that it's not really synced up with the animation. It's kind of doing it in its own time. So we'll fix those two things and then we'll be done. So the first thing to fix the arrow is simple. Just select the arrow and hit R for rotation. And we're just going to rotate it until it's pointing in the right direction. It's looking pretty good. Maybe just a touch more rotation to really get it right on that line. And then we need to deal with the sync issue, the fact that our arrow and our path are not animating at the same time. Now that's an easy thing to fix. What we're going to do is deselect all of our layers and then select them all and hit the U key. And what we can see is that our keyframes are just simply not aligned. Our start keyframe for the path is down here, but our start keyframe for the arrow is way over here. And so to fix that, I'm just going to drag the first keyframe for the arrow back to the first keyframe for the path. And of course, the last one, I'm going to sync that up with the last keyframe. And now, if we click off and drag the playhead back, we can see that it's looking pretty good. We still have a slight issue with the rotation. So we'll just go back to arrow, hit the R key. And now, if you're like me, sometimes these control points can get really annoying and almost cover up what you're trying to do. there's a very easy way to remove these points temporarily. And that is by hitting Shift Command H. And that basically removes all the overlays. Now, sometimes you definitely want those on, so remember to turn it back on if you need to. But in this case, turning them off just makes getting that rotation a little bit easier to see. And the anchor point on triangles is a little unusual. It's not actually in the dead center. So in this case, rotating it to 84 degrees I think is going to give me the best results. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so don't forget to hit Shift Command H and turn your overlays back on. And there we go. That's it, folks. Hope that showed you what you needed to learn. And you can see that animating paths is just a matter of using trim paths and then copying that path onto anything that you want to follow that path. All right, if you saw something you liked here, go ahead and hit the subscribe button or the like button. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.